Committee will come to order. As we had previously announced, we're now going to deal with the amendment offered by Ms. Norton to H.R. 5233. So the question is now on the amendment to H.R. 5233 as previously postponed. The vote will occur on the Norton amendment to H.R. 5233, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chaffetz?
No.
Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Mica? Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Desjarlais? Mr. Desjarlais votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes no. Mr. Blum? Mr. Blum votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd votes no. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes yes. Mrs. Maloney? Ms. Norton?
Aye.
Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes yes. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly? Mr. Cartwright? Ms. Duckworth? Yes. Ms. Duckworth votes yes. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Lawrence votes yes. Mr. Liu? Mrs. Watson-Coleman? Yes. Ms. Watson-Coleman votes yes. Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Desaulniers? Yes. Mr. Desaulniers votes yes. Mr. Boyle? Yes. Mr. Boyle votes yes. Mr. Welch? Yes. Mr. Welch votes yes. Ms. Lujan Grisham? Yes. Ms. Lujan Grisham votes yes. You are not recorded, Mr. Connolly.
How is Mr.
Mr. Connolly votes yes.
Mr. Mica? Mr. Mica of Florida?
Mr. Mica is not recorded.
I'm a no.
Mr. Mica votes no.
Mr. Duncan of Tennessee?
Mr. Duncan is not recorded. Mr. Duncan votes no.
Mr. DeSantis of Florida?
Mr. DeSantis is not recorded. Mr. DeSantis votes no.
Mr. Wahlberg of Michigan?
Mr. Wahlberg votes no.
Mr. Cartwright of Pennsylvania?
Mr. Cartwright votes yes.
Have all members been recorded? The clerk will report the tally. Prior to the conclusion of that, how is the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, recorded?
Mr. Farenthold is not recorded. Mr. Farenthold votes no.
Sorry, the clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 12 yeas and 22 nays.
The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 5233 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chaffetz?
Aye.
Mr. Chaffetz votes yes. Mr. Micah? Mr. Micah votes yes. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes yes. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes yes. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes yes. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Ms. Lummis? Ms. Lummis votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes yes. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes yes. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes yes. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum? Mr. Blum votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes yes. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton?
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay?
That is a no.
Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Liu? Ms. Watson-Coleman? Ms. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Ms. Lujan Grisham?
Have all members been recorded? Gentlewoman from New Mexico. Gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Lujan Grisham.
Ms. Lujan Grisham votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 22 yeas and 14 nays.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider it is laid on the table. Question is now on the vote on H.R. 5226, previously postponed. The vote will occur on adopting and favorably reporting H.R. 5226 to the House of Representatives. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chaffetz?
Aye.
Mr. Chaffetz votes yes. Mr. Micah? Mr. Micah votes yes. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes yes. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes yes. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes yes. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes yes. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes yes. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes yes. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum? Mr. Blum votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes yes. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton?
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Liu? Ms. Watson-Coleman? Ms. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Ms. Lujan Grisham? Ms. Lujan Grisham votes no.
Have all members been recorded? The clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 22 yeas and 14 nays.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 24, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2015. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 24 to require a full audit of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Banks by the Comptroller General of the United States and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I understand the sponsor of the bill, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. Without objection, we will call up the amendment in the nature of a substitute and then recognize Mr. Massey to give one statement on both the ANS and the underlying bill, or do you want to separate them out? One statement. So, without objection, again, let's call up the amendment in the nature of a substitute and then recognize Mr. Massey to give one statement on both the ANS and the underlying bill. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 24 offered by Mr. Massey of Kentucky.
Now recognize Mr. Massey for 5 minutes to explain the legislation and the ANS. Mr. Massey is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the past century, the value of the dollar has declined by over 95%. During those 100 years, the Federal Reserve, the organization established by Congress to manage Congress's Article 1, Section 8 authority to coin money and regulate the value thereof, has operated under a shroud of secrecy. My bill, H.R. 24, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, puts an end to that reign of secrecy. This is not a controversial bill. Americans demand transparency, and the House of Representatives has responded by passing this legislation twice in previous Congresses by huge bipartisan majorities. When its original author, Representative Ron Paul, first carried the Audit the Fed bill to the floor in the 112th Congress, it passed by a comfortable veto-proof majority, 327 to 98. When Representative Paul Brown brought this bill to the floor in the 113th Congress, it passed by an even larger majority, 333 to 92. In fact, among members of this very committee who were here in those Congresses, all Republicans and over half the Democrats voted for this bill on the floor. Yet, still some have asked, and will ask, why do we need this legislation? Isn't the Federal Reserve already audited? The question deserves an answer. It's true that the Government Accountability Office performs a limited financial audit of parts of the Federal Reserve, but this audit is perfunctory due to the limits placed on the GAO by Congress. The U.S. Code makes several critical exceptions to the Fed's audit protocol of its most crucial activities. Number one, GAO is prohibited from examining Fed transactions or agreements with foreign governments and foreign banks. Number two, GAO is prohibited from examining all Fed actions on monetary policy matters. Number three, GAO is prohibited from auditing transactions made at the discretion of the Federal Open Market Committee. And four, GAO cannot examine any discussion or communication among or between anyone who works at the Fed about any of the activities in the first three areas. When these restrictions were originally added in the 1970s, GAO themselves testified that they, quote, could not see how they could satisfactorily audit the Federal Reserve System without the authority to examine the largest single category of financial transactions and assets that it has, unquote. So you see, even though a cursory audit is done, a programmatic audit needs to be completed in order for Congress to understand what the Fed does and why the Fed does it. Without a complete audit, Congress can't provide oversight of an entity that it created. Let me say that again. Congress created the Federal Reserve. Congress and Congress alone has the constitutional responsibility to coin money and regulate the value thereof. We can outsource the activity, but we can't outsource our responsibility. This brings me to the other question I frequently hear, which is, won't a full audit compromise the Fed's independence? Well, the answer is that without a full audit that includes the decision-making process, how can we know that the Fed is acting independently of, for instance, the executive branch? The Fed's charter is not to be a second Treasury Department. How can we know that the Fed is operating independently of big bank CEOs and Wall Street, given the revolving door of managers between the Fed, the Treasury, and Wall Street? The opportunity for outside pressure and conflicts of interest abound at the Fed. Only a full audit can demonstrate, that the Fed makes decisions independently of the political whims of the president and independently of the profit goals of commercial banks. An organization entrusted with daily decisions that affect the value of Americans' paychecks and the value of their retirement savings, an organization whose mission has morphed into facilitating the bailout of foreign banks. This is an organization that requires a full audit and full oversight from the elected body that created it. I thank the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for co-sponsoring this legislation 3 Congresses in a row. He's a colleague on this committee from the other side of the aisle. And I want to thank Chairman Chaffetz for his leadership on this issue throughout the years and for bringing this bill for consideration in committee today. I urge my colleagues to support the bipartisan Federal Reserve Transparency Act and note that the amendment in the nature of a substitute makes only small conforming changes to the original bill. I thank you, and I yield back.
If the gentleman will yield, I really do appreciate your leadership on this. You've been tenacious about it and sharing and talking about it with other members. We're proud to bring it up today. It does enjoy good bipartisan support, as it has in previous Congresses. There really is no argument to knowingly keep yourselves in the dark. When you are arguing against transparency, when you're arguing not to know, something's probably fundamentally wrong with your argument. And so I appreciate Mr. Massey and what you've done for this, and I hope we can champion it not only through this committee but through the floor and then over to the Senate. So again, I thank you for your leadership and your being the lead sponsor on this bill. Yield back, and I assume the gentleman yields back.
Well, just let me agree with the chairman that the argument that some people make that if we actually knew what the Fed was doing, the Fed couldn't do it, is an argument that we need to know what the Fed is doing.
Exactly.
And I yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for his statement on the bill.
Thank you very much. Today is the third time our committee has reviewed this legislation to require, quote, full audit of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Banks by the Comptroller General. As I said in last Congress, I support transparency that aims to make sure that the Federal Reserve is working to carry out the economic goals of the American people. I'm still concerned that this bill would make far-reaching and unprecedented changes to the very nature of the Federal Reserve by limiting the independence that has been the cornerstone of that institution. In my opinion, this legislation is unnecessary. In 1978, the Federal Banking Agency Audit Act opened up the Federal Reserve System to audit, and regular audits have been conducted since then. Then, more recently, the Dodd-Frank Act again significantly expanded the GAO's ability to audit the Fed activities. For example, Dodd-Frank subjected the Federal Reserve's open market transactions and discount window operations to audit. The bill we are considering today would remove certain remaining audit restrictions, such as the prohibition on auditing monetary policy deliberations. Subjecting these deliberations to audit could influence how they are conducted and potentially even the policies that are chosen, degrading the true independence of the Federal Reserve. Without these protections, some could seek to inappropriately influence the Federal Reserve's deliberations in specific directions by the types and subjects of audits they request. I believe that the Federal Reserve's operation should be subject to thorough review. However, I do not support the actions that would inappropriately impede the independence of the Federal Reserve to implement monetary policies and/or its ability to support its congressionally established mandates. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does any member wish to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If not, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of the substitute offered by the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 24 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 5199, the Construction Consensus Procurement Improvement Act of 2016. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5199 to amend Title 41 United States Code to improve the manner in which federal contracts for construction and design services are awarded and to prohibit the use of reverse auctions for design and construction services procurements.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Now recognize the sponsor of the bill, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, for 5 minutes to explain the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to explain H.R. 5199. This bill really encourages competition and reduces the participation costs in the federal design and construction contracts. Current law authorizes the use of a design-build construction contracting process, which can involve a one- or two-step bid and proposal process. The one-step process requires that all parties respond with full proposals up front, meaning that participants must undertake a costly and time-intensive process. Some estimates that the architectural firms and teams competing for the public sector design-build contracts can spend a median of $260,000 making the detailed plans and models, which is a significant outlay for small businesses that make less than $1 million annually. In the one-step process, the government must evaluate numerous complex proposals, and smaller companies, design firms in particular, face the dilemma of either betting it all in on the contract that may not win or declining to compete at all. As an alternative, my bill will encourage the use of a two-step process where the potential offerors initially submit information regarding their experience and past performance, and then the government selects down to just a few of the most qualified offerers who then submit detailed price and technical proposals. The two-step design-build process ensures that the most qualified are selected for Phase 2, and those firms that make it to Phase 2 will have a greater incentive to submit a competitive proposal because they have a greater chance of winning the award. The largest federal government engineering and construction entity, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, limits the use of one-step selection procedures for design-build as a matter of policy because it's so expensive for industry to prepare the full technical and price proposals. But other parts of the federal government have not adopted this approach. Encouraging the use of the two-step process for design and construction services will reduce the cost of competing in the government marketplace for small businesses and reduce the time contracting officers must spend reviewing numerous complicated design proposals in the one-step process. This bill also includes a provision to prohibit the use of reverse auctions for the award of a contract for design and construction services. Reverse auctions which are a mechanism to bid down prices, are an important tool in the procurement toolbox, particularly commodity goods and services. However, the reverse auction tool may not be appropriate in all circumstances. The Army Corps of Engineers conducted a year-long study of reverse auctions for construction services and found that the reverse auction process did not deliver the promised savings in construction contracts. So the Army Corps found that reverse auctioning for construction services projects did not provide any, quote, any significant or even marginal edge in savings, close quote. And that construction was too variable as a service to be considered a commodity. The construction industry has argued reverse auctions are not effective in guaranteeing the lowest reasonable price or a thorough evaluation of value, and may encourage less than responsible bidding. In conclusion, this bill will reduce the barrier to entry of cost-prohibitive bid and proposal packages for small businesses and ensure that reasonable pricing in design-build construction contracting by encouraging the two-step design-build contracting process and prohibit reverse auction for the construction services. This committee approved a similar bill in the 113th Congress. And in addition to this bill, there is a very similar bill, H.R. 1666, introduced last year on this topic by Mr. Graves, which I know several of the members of this committee support. H.R. 5199 is different from that bill in that it covers the civilian contracting side, while Mr. Graves' bill covers the DOD and civilian. H.R. 5199 also includes the prohibition on reverse auctions for construction and design contracts. And with that, I encourage all my colleagues to support this effort. Again, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for his statement on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I share the concerns that have been raised by the federal construction contracting, and I believe this bill is a good faith attempt to address those concerns. The federal government spent about $32 billion on contracts for construction and architectural and engineering services in the last fiscal year. To procure these services, federal agencies can use a so-called design-build contract in which design and construction services are combined into a single contract with one company. A frequently used technique for selecting a source for this type of contract is a two-phase design-build contract. Under Step 1, companies are required to submit information related to experience and past performance. Based on that information, the agency then selects a limited number of most qualified bidders, generally 3 to 5, to advance to Phase 2. These selected bidders then submit more detailed price and technical proposals for evaluation, which often can be quite expensive and time-consuming. Due to the nature of this process, often only large companies can compete for these contracts. Smaller firms face a dilemma. They must decide whether to spend significant time, effort, and resources to compete for a project they may have little chance of winning, or refrain from competing at all. The bill would mandate the use of two-phase selection procedures for a design-build contract with a value of $750,000 or more. This bill would also prohibit so-called reverse auctions when contracting for construction services. While reverse auctions are a valuable tool when purchasing commodities, asking companies to bid progressively lower for construction contracts could raise different challenges. Mr. Chairman, I believe that we need to do all that we can in an effort to make the procurement process as fair and affordable as possible, and this legislation is definitely a step in the right direction. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill?
Chairman, I have an amendment.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5199, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland, in Section 3, in the matter proposed to be inserted by subsection A1, strike $750,000 each place it appears, and insert $3 million.
Yeah.
The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment, and without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Chairman, I'm offering this on behalf of Mr. Lynch and myself. as an amendment. I support the Ranking Member Lynch's amendment, which would increase the threshold for mandatory use of two-phase selection procedures for design build contracts to $3 million. This amendment would strengthen the bill to ensure that the use of the two-phase process is not mandated when its use is not truly warranted. In fact, the $750,000 contract is often one that would require only a one-phase selection process. But without this amendment, the bill would mandate a two-phase process that could be a waste of agency resources. I urge members to support the amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for this amendment offered on behalf of himself and Mr. Lynch, and raising this threshold from $750,000 to $3 million is actually a welcomed amendment. This threshold obviously will allow us to not only still ensure that lower cost entry for small businesses is recognized, and finally, I understand that there's a coalition of some 15 construction industry, trade, and professional organizations that support this bill and the amendment. And so with that, I would encourage all my colleagues to support the Cummings-Lynch amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? I would like to simply comment that I appreciate the work of Mr. Lynch and Mr. Cummings in working with Mr. Meadows. This is a good amendment, and look forward to supporting it, and I yield back. Any other member wish to speak on the amendment? If none, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts, or by the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? If none, the question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 5199 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is Senate Bill 1550, the Program Management Improvement Accountability Act, and the clerk will designate the bill.
S 1550, to amend Title 31 United States Code to establish entities tasked with improving program and project management in certain federal agencies and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask, why are we marking up the Senate bill and not the House bill?
We have tried as best we can to find the right balance between moving bills out of the House, which we do far more of than the Senate does, and in try to open up that and move it forward and move the process forward, made a decision that this would be the best method to do that. It's helpful. We encourage them to take up some of the House bills. We also encourage and take up some of the Senate bills.
Thank you. I accept the Chairman's explanation because there has to be reciprocity, and I've been involved in that. But when we actually have a member of the committee who is a co-author of a bill, I would hope deference would be given to members of our own committee before we start marking up Senate bills.
And the gentleman brings up a good point, because in the Senate feels the same way. And what I've tried to do as best I can, and it's very subjective, is to try to find that balance where we take up some of the Senate bills and hopefully they take up some of our House bills. But I do hope at the end of the day, we get a bill to the President's desk, and we on both sides of the aisle, and both the House and the Senate, can also go back and let our constituents know that we're all trying to make good things happen and pass bills, and it's got to ultimately pass both bodies as well. So,
I thank the Chair.
and please, as we have these, I would also note that as we have these happen in the future, we announce these markups in advance. Just please work with us on those, and we'll try as best we can at the staff level and between the chairman here and the ranking member to come to a good, plausible solution as well. So, and I will keep that in mind. Again, the item under consideration is Senate Bill 1550, the Program Management Improvement Act, and the clerk will designate the bill. Did we already do that? We did do that. Sorry, I got off track. I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment without objection so ordered, and now recognize myself for this, to talk about the bill. In fiscal year 2017, the federal government will spend more than $4 trillion. Given that tremendous amount of spending, a 2013 Accenture study found that 1% increase in efficiency could save the federal government nearly $1 trillion by 2015. As you have that 1% in efficiency, as it radiates out over the course of the years and the accumulation, it has a very big effect on government. An effective program and project managers are both the first line of defense against waste, fraud, and abuse throughout the government and the best positioned employees to increase efficiency as we move forward. Of course, the opposite is true as well, and ineffective and inefficient programs and project managers can cost the federal government literally billions of dollars over the course of time. In the private sector, program management has become its own discipline, but similar support for professionals in the federal workforce is lagging behind. According to a report by the National Academy of Public Administration, there are 5 significant challenges to improving program management capabilities in the federal government. First, laws do not holistically address challenges of project management. Program management is not recognized as an important discipline for improving performance and results. Agency executives and stakeholders do not understand their roles and responsibilities. Training and development of program managers often lack consistency across federal government, and program managers lack a professional community to provide support and voice concerns about program management development. Senate Bill 1550 addresses these challenges to ensure that the management professional in our federal workforce have the guidance, support, and professional standards necessary to improve efficiency. And by developing standards-based models for program managers throughout the federal government, this bill will establish a base of professional and effective program managers, which will help Congress in our persistent struggle to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not wasted. I encourage my colleagues to support this piece of legislation, and now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for any statement on this bill.
I'll be very brief, Mr. Chairman. I support this bipartisan legislation to improve program management practices in the federal agencies. I want to thank Representative Connolly, the lead Democratic sponsor of the bill, for its hard work on the legislation. The bill would require the development of standard policies and guidelines across the federal government for program management. It would also establish an interagency program management policy council to develop best practices and focus on improving the management of federal programs. The bill would also require the Office of Personnel Management to establish a new career path for program and project management and to identify key skills and competencies for such jobs. This is a good bipartisan measure that would help improve the management of the federal government. I urge its adoption. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. It is a good bipartisan bill. Again, I think it is worthy of note, Mr. Conley and his work and passion on this as well. Do any other members wish to speak on this bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? I have an amendment to the bill. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to S 1550, offered by Mr. Chavitz of Utah.
Recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Offering this technical amendment to Senate Bill 1550 to clarify the ambiguous language about membership of the Program Management Policy Council. As written, Senate Bill 1550 allows the chairman of the council to appoint any individual as a member of the council, including people from the private sector. This amendment clarifies that the interagency council is limited to federal employees and removes a provision related to the Federal Advisory Committee Act because it would no longer apply. It is a simple technical amendment, and I would urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Are there any other discussion on the amendment? If none, the question is now on the amendment offered by myself, by me. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the bill? If none, the question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting Senate Bill 1550 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. In the interest of time, we're going to move the following post office naming bills under a unanimous consent agreement. We have consulted with the minority and our members and have agreed to move these bipartisan bills expeditiously. I would ask unanimous consent that the committee favorably report the following post office naming bills to the House. Okay. I ask unanimous consent that the committee favorably report the following post office naming bills to the House. H.R. 433, H.R. 2607, H.R. 3218, with an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself, H.R. 3931, H.R. 3953, H.R. 4010, H.R. 4425, H.R. 4747, H.R. 4761, H.R. 4777, H.R. 4877, H.R. 4925, H.R. 4960, H.R. 4975, H.R. 4987, and H.R. 5028, with an amendment in the nature of the substitute offered by the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence. Does any member wish to speak on any of these bills? Ms. Lawrence is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is a pleasure for me to participate in the naming of a post office, recognizing how we can take individuals who made significant changes in their community, to our country, to honor their service. It is with great honor that I recommend the naming of a Jefferson Station to be the Mary E. McCoy. Ms. McCoy rose from slavery, became an organizer, a leader of the advancement of women. She was the wife of what many people call the real McCoy, Elijah McCoy. She was from the city of Detroit. She was very active in starting the Detroit Phyllis Wheatley Home for Aged Colored Women and served on the home vice president under her leadership. She purchased a home where 40 women reside. And I just want, as we take this to the floor and make the recommendations, for people to understand when you drive by postal facilities and see names on them, it's out of a lot of research and out of respect for individuals and way to honor individuals in our community. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. Does any other member wish to speak on any of these bills? If not, without objection, as previously listed, the bills as previously listed are favorably reported to the House. Without objection, pursuant to Clause 2L of House Rule 11, members will have 2 days to submit views on the bills considered today. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Hearing no objections, so ordered. There's no further business. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks, everyone.